Hi, everyone. I'm Maggie McGrath, editor of Forbes Women. The 2024 general election has been hailed by some people as the battle of the sexes, with polling between men and women at really wide points between former President Donald Trump and Vice President Kamala Harris. Joining us now is someone who is a bit of an expert on gender dynamics and feminism. She is Serene Khader, a professor of philosophy and also the author of the new book, Faux Feminism: Why We Fall for White Feminism and How We Can Stop. It came out last week. Serene, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me, Maggie.
So this is a really prescient book to be writing and to be publishing a week before the 2024 general election. I want to start with kind of a broad question, but what do you make of the gender dynamics of this election? I referenced in the intro the double-digit percentage divide between men and women and how each group is breaking for former President Trump or Vice President Kamala Harris. What's your reaction to this moment in political history?
Well, I think women voters feel a tremendous amount of urgency because the final leg of this election has really become about gender and about whether we will see the gains of feminism continuing or whether we'll see them rolled back. And I think both parties have really known that it is women voters who are going to decide this election. And so we've seen in this last couple of weeks, both parties kind of lock in on women, but in different ways. But I think we see the gender gap partly because I think women are aware of the ways in which the last Trump presidency rolled back their rights. And I think also because Kamala Harris is foregrounding issues that really matter to women, like abortion and childcare.
We'll get into some of those issues that, as you say, she is foregrounding. But I want to start by also asking you about a piece that you wrote where you basically talk about Trump is pulling from white feminism's playbook. What does that mean exactly? And I think this dovetails nicely with the book that you just released.
Yeah, there's a long history in feminism that people may or may not be aware of women who are kind of the most privileged women or elite women, in many cases white women, but also in many cases upper class women, middle class women, uh, fighting for what they say is women's rights, but actually what ends up being only the rights of a small minority of women or just part of the group. And it's that's sometimes happened on purpose. It's sometimes happened inadvertently. I think there's a lot of gradations in which it can happen. But I think one of the things we have seen Trump do in the last several weeks, especially, is try to appeal to women, but by using arguments that are racially charged, for example. So we saw starting in October this language where Donald Trump started saying that he was going to be women's protectors. So I think one feminist analysis we can have of that, and we should, is that it's condescending. It doesn't speak to the fact that women really have the rights to be our own people now. But it also, another element of this is that he at that time was quite explicit that he wanted to protect women so that they would feel, quote, safe at the border, and also talked on many occasions there about wanting women to feel safe in cities. We know that the border rhetoric is ongoing. So I think we also need to sort of be aware of the fact that the way that he is talking about women is not just kind of patronizing and misogynistic, but is also designed to and kind of brings back up this historical trend of using rhetoric about women to actually demonize people of color.
That's a really sharp analysis. And Serene, in the past few weeks, really in the past few days, we've heard former President Trump say, I'm going to protect women whether they like it or not. And that whether they like it or not has been ringing across certain aspects of the social media accounts that I follow. I don't know about you, but what do you make of that addition? So we talked about what the protect does and the implications there, but the whether they like it or not, is there significance to that?
I think it really speaks to this man who has a powerful history of defending people who engage in sexual abuse of women and not treating women's consent as though it's important. I don't know if this was what was on the corners of social media that you saw, but for me, I really felt a lot of whiplash back to 2016, right before the election, when at that time Donald Trump had, a video had surfaced of Trump bragging about grabbing women without their consent, and in fact said at that time, because he seems to have a particular awareness of and desire to protect men in power who use their power over women. He said at that time, if you are rich, they'll let you do it. So in a certain way, what he's saying now is very consistent with what he said in 2016, saying, I'm going to protect you whether you like it or not, speaks to his longstanding kind of lack of interest in women's own voices and women's consent. And it's worth adding that this isn't just rhetoric about him or like about Trump as a person. Of course, although we should remember that this is a person and a candidate who has been found liable for sexual abuse by a jury in New York. So there have been several allegations made against him. But to extend it beyond him, I think there are reasons to be concerned that Trump has protected men in power who abuse women in a bunch of ways. Most recently, for example, Rhode Island Senator Sheldon Whitehouse conducted an investigation that revealed that then President Donald Trump that his White House had been engaged in preventing people who could corroborate Christine Blasey Ford's testimony against Brett Kavanaugh to light.
Switching gears a little bit, you mentioned some of the policies that Vice President Kamala Harris has proposed on the campaign trail, and you have also written about how childcare has become one of the key essential issues this election cycle. Can you talk about, from your expertise as a professor, as an author, why it is at this moment that issue seems to be resonating?
I think one reason that issue is resonating is just because feminists have cared about it for decades, whether or not we have been successful at making policy that goes with it. And the reason feminists have been talking about it for decades is that almost all women's lives are really attached to what happens with the fate of women's labor in the household. Women who are stay-at-home moms work in the household all day. Women who are not stay-at-home moms, who are so-called working moms, but I think all moms are working moms, they have their labor. So we have our labor supported by the labor usually of other women who take care of our children, who end up helping clean our houses, and they themselves have children and face many of the same obstacles to finding childcare and to having what we might call work-life balance that all women face. So one reason this is important is because it's always been important. But I think there's also this reality that the pandemic was a watershed moment for our cultural consciousness about childcare in particular, but about women's labor in general. I have two small children. When the pandemic began, I had one. And I remember that sort of snap in which it went from, my child was 15 months old when the pandemic began. So I thought I was just returning to my professional life. And instead what happened is that there was this moment when it was like, actually, you have to do two jobs at once full time. And the world is just going to expect you to to continue with your normal life while that is going on. There were maybe 2 weeks where people acknowledged that it was difficult to have your baby on Zoom all the time. And then you had to keep going. And so I think part of what we're seeing right now is that the floodgates have been opened. People realize that women and families need affordable childcare and that childcare workers need better conditions. And rhetoric about that we're hearing, for example, from JD Vance about how more women should be stay-at-home moms or something like that just isn't going to cut it. Childcare has become this major election issue, one, because it's important, but two, because we are 4 years out of this pandemic that made us unable to shut the door on women's labor.
I like that you said it's important because it's always been important. To your point, the pandemic really was the primal scream. That was a headline that I
Yeah.
distinctly remember from that time. But caregiving in general has been an issue. And I've been interested in the vice president's proposal to use Medicare to cover some senior care. And I've been a little surprised we haven't seen much talk about that. So we'll be watching the exit polls very closely because they're not out yet right now on Tuesday night at 5:30, but they are coming. What is your prediction, Serene? Because we've seen some of the early voting numbers, the enthusiasm among women. What do you think we're going to be hearing from the female electorate in terms of the issues that drove them to the polls?
I think we are already hearing that feminism is a big part of what drove women to the polls, and in particular that abortion and childcare are issues related to that. And I think actually, to some extent, the Trump campaign has been surprised by how motivating abortion has been for women. So for example, there's the data coming out of Iowa that says that boomer women actually seem pretty outraged by the overturning of Roe versus Wade. And I think that may have surprised some folks because they may have thought, oh, if you're no longer having children, then you are no longer interested in this issue. But I think for many women of that generation, it's very much the opposite. They remember what life was like when abortion was illegal in this country. They don't want to go back to that time. And I think also, on a more sort of positive note, I think we are seeing lots of women talk about the momentousness of this moment where they can vote for a woman for the first time. I think, people ask me about young women a lot, but I'm really interested in the generations that are older than me and kind of how they're responding to this moment, because we have to recognize that there are women out there voting today who were born before women had a right to vote in this country. And there are also women out there voting today, women of color, who grew up in a racially segregated America. So I think that Kamala Harris has focused really tightly on the issues and not on her own identity. But I also think that for many women voters, being able to vote for a woman and a woman of color has been a motivator.
Now, just a few days ago, we heard from former House Representative Liz Cheney that women will save this election. And again, as someone who wrote a book about some of the more problematic aspects of feminism, I wanted to quickly ask you about that statement. Is that empowering, or is that too much pressure on women who are voting today and have voted in early voting over the last several weeks?
Well, I do think it's a lot of pressure when you put it that way. But I also think that if we do, that women are likely to save this election. We know, and the data shows, that it's women voters who will make the difference. And I think a lot of what we saw in the aftermath of 2016, which was an election in which a majority of white women voted for Donald Trump, it was a lot of will to do things differently this time. And I think I'm hopeful that will can be translated into action, and I'm not just hopeful about the will. I think also, I think a lot of women will be able to, and more women than historically have, will be able to see through some of Trump and Vance's rhetoric about women. I think they know when Trump says that he is going to protect them, whether they like it or not, that they are hearing about somebody who didn't protect their rights to control their bodies, who has had multiple accusations of rape and sexual abuse against him. And they also know that J.D. Vance's kind of rhetoric about how he sees moms and he wants to create a more pro-child country is actually not very meaningful when there's no money for childcare attached and no care for childcare workers attached. He said in the vice presidential debate, for example, that he wanted to give women more choices about childcare, but then he proceeded to go on and say that he meant no increase in federal monies for these issues. So what does choice mean if there's no support? I think American women will be able to see through that tonight.
Serene Khader, thank you so much for joining us on what is a very busy and exciting night. And congratulations on the release of your book, Faux Feminism. We so appreciate your time and your insight.
Thank you so much for having me, Maggie. Have a wonderful night.